welcome everybody. My name's Steve Taylor from the Rio Grande Guardian. I'm so pleased to be moderating this discussion. Really looking forward to this one. We've titled it, working with the Olof Palme Center in Mexico City. Title of today's discussion, North American Relations under Biden. We couldn't have left it any later to do this as the inauguration takes place in Washington tomorrow. And so let me just quickly introduce our speakers today, starting with Maria Cristina Rosas from the Olof Palme Center in Mexico City. This is her brainchild. She comes up with some great topics for these discussions. So welcome, Maria Cristina. And also with us from Canada, Kim Richard Nosal, who is Professor Emeritus at Queen's University, Kingston in Ontario, Canada. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you.
We have Tony Payan, who I was told just before the start was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, which he's back here. He is a fellow for Mexico Studies. I will butcher the name, so I'll let him tell us the name of the group at Rice University. Tony, how do we pronounce that? Francois?
Francois and Edward Dirigen.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to your commentary here. And third, finally, David Shirk, Department Chair and Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of San Diego. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Maria Cristina, I don't know if you wanted to kick things off. If not, what I would like to do, given the tumultuous events here in the United States over the last couple of weeks, this is really for our speakers, both from Mexico and Canada. Cast your mind back just a week or so, December the 6th, Washington, D.C., as two academics and commentators from other countries. Could you believe what you saw on your TV sets coming from the US Capitol on December 6th? As someone from another country, just give us your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank our speakers, fellow speakers. I'm happy to have Kim Nosal and David Shirk and Tony Payan. And of course you, Steve. I believe it is a fascinating moment to analyze what North American relations under Biden would be, because there are very unique moments for tomorrow's inauguration that may lead to different scenarios that I would like to discuss with you. Speaking about the uniqueness of Biden's inauguration, and to answer your question, I believe the moment that Biden is facing internally is very challenging. I'm talking about the pandemic, but I'm talking also about the consequences of the pandemic, especially the crisis. We have now a major economic crisis. Well, this is all over the world, but it's especially hard in the US, unemployment, stagnation. And also there is another unique issue that Biden is facing, the divided country, the legacy of Donald Trump, Trumpism without Trump. Tomorrow, Trump will no longer be the president of the US, but his legacy is a divided United States. And despite Biden has stated clearly that he wants to work for a united country and he wants to work for all Americans, this is going to be very hard to deal with. So that said, let me speak about the immediate challenges that I believe Biden will be facing. I believe that internal priorities may dominate over international priorities, at least during the first months of his administration. But of course, there's the need for Biden to reverse the damage caused by the Trump administration to international relations. For example, on issues such as climate change, you know that Joe Biden has already announced that the US will be back to the Paris agreements on climate change. There's also a lot of work to do when it comes to health diplomacy. Under Trump, the United States renounced to lead the world in the response against the pandemic. And we expect that by helping Americans, by helping the US to sort out the pandemic, the US may be able to lead the world to fight the disease. Also, there's a number of issues pertaining relations, US relations with key allies, such as the Europeans, Western European countries, Japan, South Korea, and also there's a need to improve relations with China and Russia, and also the multilateral scope of the participation of US in international organizations such as UNESCO, from which Trump withdrew the US at the beginning of his administration, and also, and more important, the World Health Organization, that is, a key actor during the pandemic. So Biden needs to heal the scars in the international arena, but I believe internal priorities may attract most of his attention and effort at the beginning of his administration. Now, speaking about North American relations, Biden, and I'm sure you remember, Steve, and our audience, that we have had 2 previous webinars on North American relations in the context of the elections in the US. And one issue we were discussing was the possibility of recreating or re-establishing the sense of a North American community, because under Trump, we remember that Trump favored bilateral over trilateral relations in North America. He preferred to talk directly to Mexico and directly to Canada, but he prevented, for instance, the development of a North American dialogue that we were having since I began 2005 under the idea of these North American summits. I'm sure you remember this. The last time we had a North American summit was in 2016, before Trump came into power, and that summit took place in Ottawa. We remember, the then Mexican President Peña Nieto with the Prime Minister of Canada and Obama shaking hands just across the Canadian Parliament. And that happened in 2016. And after that, once Trump became president, we didn't have any other North American summit. So I expect that somehow Biden is able to reestablish a North American dialogue, because it is needed. There are many issues of common interest, among them, of course, the USMCA, the US, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, and the issues that are involved in this agreement, among others. Now, I should say, I believe Kim Nosal is going to explain this in detail. I believe that Biden seems to be more ideologically connected to Justin Trudeau than to López Obrador. During the Trump administration, it was the opposite. Trump was very much linked ideologically, politically speaking, to López Obrador, and they got along, as we know. Thus, from a North American point of view, Mexico may face, I believe, some isolation with respect to Canada-US relations, but that's something we can discuss later. Mexico may be also facing controversies with its 2 North American partners due to some USMCA provisions, such as labor, environment, and most of all, energy issues. Now, speaking about Mexican-American relations, and I will stop here, I believe that AMLO has put a lot of effort in challenging Biden several times, before the elections and after the November elections. For instance, number one, he met in Washington with President Trump, as we all remember. This is the only international trip made by López Obrador, who is very much reluctant to travel abroad, as you know. And while in Washington, López Obrador didn't hold a meeting with the Biden campaign, neither with Nancy Pelosi or key Democrats. So that's number one. Number two, after the presidential elections, López Obrador took a lot of time to congratulate Biden for his victory, despite the advice of our Mexican ambassador to Washington, Marta Bárcena. She several times told him, you must recognize his victory, you must congratulate him. And he didn't pay attention to that. Number 3, by the end of 2020, López Obrador and Morena, the dominating political force in our Congress, approved a new national security law that limits cooperation with the US, probably as retaliation for the previous detention of General Cienfuegos, the former Mexican Minister of Defense. And more recently, and this is number 4, López Obrador suggested he would like to grant political asylum to Julian Assange, the creator of WikiLeaks. One may remember the turmoil caused during the Felipe Calderón administration by the revelations of WikiLeaks that even led to the resignation of the then American ambassador to Mexico, Carlos Pascual. So these are challenges that López Obrador has used. This is the way López Obrador is challenging Biden, and well, it seems this is creating a very difficult environment for Mexican-American relations. That said, let me finish by saying that Biden, despite these challenges posed to him by López Obrador, doesn't seem to hold grudges. There is not resentment against López Obrador, I believe. Biden is institutional. Don't forget that. He's institutional and understands that Mexico and the US will always be neighbors and need to sort the bilateral agenda out, mostly in the key areas that define the relationship, that is trade, security, and migration. There may be frictions, though, in dealing with the environmental agenda, the labor agenda, and yes, the migration reform and energy issues and such. But, well, I believe Biden is a person with whom Mexico and the Mexican president can work and sort the agenda out. Biden, by the way, will need a new ambassador to Mexico because, as I'm sure you know, Christopher Landau, who has a very personal relationship and friendship with Donald Trump, is leaving the American embassy. So Biden may have to appoint for embassies around the world big donors, fundraisers, people who help him during his campaign. But in the case of Mexico, being Mexico so important, I believe that he may favor a career diplomat. Happily, we knew just a couple of days ago that Roberta Jacobson, former ambassador of the US to Mexico, is in Biden's transitional team, and she will be providing her advice and guidance on migration and related issues at the National Security Council. And that's very good news. As for Mexico is concerned, well, you know that Ambassador Marta Bárcena has decided to retire from the foreign service. She will be back to Mexico. She told me she will be back probably by March. So her replacement has already been announced by López Obrador. The replacement of Marta Bárcena will be the former Minister of Education, Esteban Moctezuma, who is a political appointee with no diplomatic experience. So those are the issues I would like to start with. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maria Cristina. Tremendously detailed analysis there. It seems from what you're saying that Biden will have a much better relationship to start with Trudeau than López Obrador. So I'd like to kick it over to Kim Nosal. What's your analysis of the Biden's the relationship Biden will have linking the US and Canada? How things going to be there?
Well, let me begin by thanking the Olive Palm Center very much for sponsoring this, and to Maria Cristina for inviting me to participate. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Mr. Trudeau, like most foreign leaders, I think is looking forward tomorrow to having a normal administration in Washington with a normal president. someone who is not a mercantilist, who sort of obsesses over trade deficits and surpluses like a 16th century Spanish king, who doesn't believe that every other country in the world is out to screw the United States, someone who doesn't use Twitter to slag other leaders, someone who believes in multilateralism, someone who believes in trade, someone who believes in America's alliances, someone who believes in science. In other words, what we're going to start with tomorrow, quite clearly, is a normal president and a normal administration. But even if Mr. Trudeau gets on much better with Mr. Biden than he clearly did with Mr. Trump, that return to normalcy, it seems to me, doesn't simply mean turning the clock back to before 2016. It doesn't mean, bluntly put, that everything's going to be rosy. And for Canada, on the contrary, returning to normal means that some of the normal ongoing problems in Canadian-American relations are going to resurface now that there is a competent administration in Washington, an administration that is knowledgeable about America's global and international interests in a way that the Trump administration, in my humble opinion, simply wasn't, and an administration that is keen to press American interests in a comprehensive and effective way. So let me outline a couple of key problems, and I'll sort of move through them fairly quickly. We can discuss them more later. The first, and here let me echo Maria Cristina, and that is on energy. The emergence of the US as an energy independent economy has huge implications for Canada, which of course depends heavily on Alberta's energy production in the oil sands and getting that energy to market. And we've already seen, even before the inauguration has been completed, that the pipeline politics between Canada and the United States have already reemerged, with Mr. Biden's promise to cancel the XL pipeline from Canada into the United States. And also we see other problems such as Michigan, the Michigan governor's concern over Line 5 that runs through Michigan from Western Canada to Eastern Canada. So that's going to be a problem in the years ahead. Secondly, and in a related way, we're going to see problems on climate policy. Now, Canadians, like most others in the world, are exceedingly pleased that Mr. Biden is going to reverse the Trump administration's policy on returning to the Paris Climate Accord. But a serious climate policy that is likely to be undertaken by the Biden administration, a policy driven by science, is actually going to be more problematic for Canada because Canada, generally speaking, on such matters, has lagged behind the United States, and thus the Biden administration may in fact push the Trudeau government further along in that area than it had might have originally wanted. Next, trade. Now, it's great that Joe Biden is not a mercantilist. On the other hand, Mr. Biden is not a robust free trader either. There are all sorts of reasons for him, domestic political reasons, for him and his administration to continue to embrace different kinds of protectionism. And keep in mind that historically, Democrats have been far more protectionist than classical Republicans, not Trumpian Republicans, but old-fashioned classical pre-Trumpian Republicans. And thus, a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic White House is likelier to be more accepting of protectionist policies, such as Mr. Biden's pledge to buy American. On matters of defense, the Biden administration is going to want to reinvigorate America's alliances, but that actually is going to put Canada in the spotlight, ironically much more so than the Trump years. The irony is that Mr. Trump had no time for America's alliances, but he never actually understood how America's alliances worked. It seems to me that he saw America's alliances as little more than sort of grubby protection rackets. Now we have an administration in Washington that understands what America's alliances are. And the Biden administration is likely to push hard for all of America's allies, including Canada, to take defense much more seriously, ironically, than the Trump administration. And that's going to pose some interesting hassles for the Canadian government, which never likes to spend money on defense. The problem is that a robust American defense policy is going to require a considerable amount of spending by the Canadian government. Let me conclude with one element here, and I want to echo Maria Christina's concern, and that is that American politics is going to continue to pose a challenge for the Canadian-American relationship, because what we saw in November was the defeat of Trump, but as Maria Christina reminds us, not of Trumpism. We can never lose sight of the fact that 74 million Americans took a look at Mr. Trump and wanted 4 more years of his administration. And so that signals to everyone in the international system that, in fact, while there is huge welcome for Biden and a Biden administration, we can never lose sight of the fact that huge numbers of Americans continue to be driven by the ideas, such as they are, of Trumpism. So let me stop there and passer la parole and return to some of these issues during the discussion period. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, let's move on to David. You've heard the analysis of Maria Christina and Kim. From your perspective, the North American relations under a Biden administration, what can we expect?
Well, I'm more of a Mexico expert, of course, so I'm going to focus more on the U.S.-Mexico relationship, but I do think that we will see an improvement of our relationship with Canada. Canada and Mexico are the two countries that have traditionally been visited first and hosted first by the U.S. president. For many years, the U.S. president went first to Canada. In recent years, or in recent presidential administrations, both Presidents Bush and Obama, I believe, went first to Mexico. President Trump went first on his first state visit to Saudi Arabia. A very unusual and puzzling choice for many foreign policy experts, but it was very symbolic, I think, of the orientation of the outgoing administration here in the United States. I think that we will see an effort by the Trump administration to recognize both Canada and Mexico as our two most important foreign policy relationships. They are neighboring countries. They are our most important trading partners, certainly from the perspective of U.S. exporters. And so I think that there will be, as Kim pointed out, a return to normalcy. I do think that there are longstanding issues in the U.S.-Canadian trade relationship that will continue to pose sticking points, lumber and some other areas. But I think that having to deal with those issues will now seem like minor irritants in the relationship, the US-Canada relationship, compared to the highly unpredictable and often confrontational relationship that we saw between Trump and Trudeau. But I'd like to focus mainly on the Mexico relationship, and I want to address some of the points that have been made about the tensions between the incoming Biden administration and Lopez Obrador. There was a big article yesterday in the New York Times about this issue. We heard I think a very keen analysis of that from Maria Cristina about the efforts by the Lopez Obrador administration to assert national sovereignty and in some ways even reject the Biden administration. And I'm a little bit maybe of an outlier and a skeptic about this idea that that Lopez Obrador is a victim of Síndrome de Estocolmo or Helsinki syndrome in his relationship with Donald Trump. I think that for too many people, Lopez Obrador is simply a left-wing populist ideologue, and we often fail to recognize just how pragmatic and shrewd he is as a politician. And I view his 4-year relationship with Donald Trump as a relationship in which he did not have many options, and took the most rational policy positions that he could towards the United States, and the friendliest posture that he could towards the United States, in order to fly under the radar and avoid confrontations with the Trump administration. But I don't think that he's secretly in love with Donald Trump. And I do think that, like Trudeau, he will be very pleased to see him walk out the door of the White House tomorrow, or maybe he's already left. I think he might be in Florida right now. But I don't think that Andrés Manuel López Obrador will miss Donald Trump. And some of the recent discussion of this in the press seems to suggest that he's thrown up a number of obstacles for the Biden administration. I don't necessarily buy that. For one thing, on the idea of deliberately snubbing an incoming U.S. president by not recognizing his electoral victory, we have to remember who we're dealing with. We're talking about López Obrador, who spent months protesting his own claims of his own perceived electoral fraud in 2006, and who was an actual victim of electoral fraud at many stages during his political career, particularly in his bid to become the mayor of Mexico City, or the head of the Mexico City government. There was real fraud. There were actual stolen ballots dumped on the plaza in Mexico City from the Tabasco elections when he was governor, or when he was running for governor of Tabasco. And so I think for him to take the position that I'm not going to get involved in your electoral disputes, I'm not going to cast judgment, I think was actually both pragmatic and a reflection of his personal political experiences. And it makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, he has recognized the Biden government, and again, did so at the point at which it would have the least alienating impact on President Trump. So I give him actually credit for that decision. I also think that, there's been much made about the Mexican government's recent decision to drop all charges against General Salvador Cienfuegos, who was accused by the US government with pretty damning electronic surveillance of drug corruption, colluding with a little-known group of drug traffickers who were an offshoot of the Beltran Leyva organization known as the H2 cartel, or at least called the H2 cartel by the US government. The decision to restrict US operatives in Mexican territory. I don't see that as a thumbing of Lopez Obrador's nose to the Biden administration. I see that as a necessary response to Lopez Obrador's domestic constituency. Not the Mexican voters, of course, but the Mexican, on which this government is surprisingly dependent and surprisingly vulnerable. The Mexican military was very displeased that one of their own members, even from a former administration for which Lopez Obrador has no love, right? I think that the Mexican military was adamant that Cienfuegos be returned to Mexico and that he be left alone. Because any effort to investigate Cienfuegos would necessarily reveal other skeletons in the closet. I think this is no offense to Joe Biden. This is not intended as an offense to Joe Biden. This is an act of self-preservation for the sitting Mexican president in dealing with a very powerful and necessary instrument of the Mexican state. And so, I think that it will be, and mind you, the fact that Cienfuegos was taken into U.S. custody was done completely unilaterally, right? It was something arguably Joe Biden might not have done. That kind of unilateral action by the U.S. Justice Department really illustrates maybe more the mentality of people within the Trump administration and or under Bill Barr than what we might expect to see under Joe Biden. I think to me, what's surprising is the decision to go ahead and do this in the last months, the last year of the Trump administration. I'm not sure what they were hoping to accomplish. I'm not sure why they decided to act, but it certainly backfired. So I think the point I'd like to make is that we have to understand that Lopez Obrador is certainly likely to assert himself somewhat more in his relationship with Biden than he did under Trump, but it's only because he can. It's only because he's no longer a hostage, and he can be himself a little bit more. But I do think at the end of the day, we're likely to see a much more cooperative relationship and collaborative relationship under the Biden administration than we did under the Trump administration. These two presidents are going to need to continue to cooperate on trade, on migration, on water, and other border issues. They're also going to need to cooperate on security, but it's going to need to be a bilateral approach to security. And frankly, there are real questions right now in Washington, real skepticism about the Merit Initiative and about the state of U.S.-Mexico cooperation, and about whether our tax dollars have been well spent over the last decade, given that Mexico's security situation has not significantly improved. In fact, it's gotten a good deal worse than it was in 2008, 2009. So I think it's arguably high time for some rethinking of the strategy and the approach. One thing that will loom large, I think, in discussions about security is the fact that Mexico, I think, is on the verge of approving or finally legalizing marijuana. We don't have a problem with Canada on that issue, and I suspect we won't have a problem with Mexico if they decide to go the same route. Given, of course, that almost half of the United States is now a de facto legal regime for consumption of marijuana. So I think we're going to see opportunities on the security front to really rethink what our goals are and how we want to work together. And I think, you know, worrying about what happened with General Cienfuegos is going to fade into the rearview mirror in several months. As a last point, the most important thing that these two presidents will need to work on, and obviously have a strong incentive to work on together, is COVID-19. This is actually, I think, a tremendous opportunity. The virus, the crisis, presents an opportunity for the Biden administration to build goodwill with the Lopez Obrador administration in facilitating access to the vaccine, in helping to address a crisis that has frankly gotten even more out of control in Mexico than in the United States. And I think with the right approach, hopefully with a knowledgeable and experienced ambassador, whether it's a career diplomat or someone with long ties to Joe Biden that has worked on Mexico and Latin America, someone like Shannon O'Neill, who traveled to Mexico City with Joe Biden, who traveled much of Latin America with Joe Biden when he was vice president. Whoever takes charge, I think we're going to need a sensible and deft approach to trying to build goodwill in working together on the most serious crisis confronting not only North America, but the entire world. So I'll stop there and look forward to Tony's comments.
Thank you, David. Yes, Tony, sorry to make you wait.
All right.
In-depth analysis from the other three experts there. Now it's your turn.
Thank you, Steve. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here with David, an old friend, and of course, Maria Cristina. Thank you for the invitation. And Kim, nice to meet you. I'm always interested in North America as such. I think the seed planted by Robert Pastor in his book, The North American Idea, is something that we need to retake. It really is an important, and I think ever more important contribution that he made as a scholar. And I think that many of us who are interested in North America ought to take another look. It's not going to be a straight line road. It's going to be a circuitous route, but I think it's something that we ought to be thinking about. Here are some of the thoughts that I had. I don't think that we can deny that the relationship between Lopez Obrador and Trump was there, surprisingly so, because I think Trump did treat Mexico and Mexicans quite poorly. There was a rhetoric, and so most of us expected a very confrontational relationship, and yet these men found an accommodation of sorts. I don't think it was a friendship, not in the way that you find the chemistry, say, between Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, not in that sense, where you have, or even between Obama and other world leaders, in which you almost had a personal relationship, and you felt that they could actually pick up the phone and they would answer each other's phones and cut through the chase and go straight down to the communication. But it was there. So the question, I think, is what are affinities made of, and how is it that all these circuits were able to connect between Trump and Lopez Obrador? How is it that they found an accommodation of each other's interests? And I think it was all about their style of politics. There are too many of these wires that connected. They're both very nationalistic. They both undermined their administrative apparatuses in their countries. They talked about a deep state López Obrador talked about a conspiracy from within the government. So in that sense, that was another wire that kind of connected. They both exhibited a disregard for the rule of law. López Obrador still does. Trump certainly did. So they found another connection there. They also despised the opposition and treated it with insults instead of as partners and individuals and groups who have to be engaged in negotiations. They attacked the press, and so there were a number of issues that I think they found in common. And above all, I think their nationalistic perspective of the respective nations. America first, and of course, Mr. Trump said it many times at the United Nations in the very beginning. America will be first. I'll be dedicated to America, and I suggest that you all do the same. And I think López Obrador got the message. He found the right message in it, and he put Mexico first. I'm not sure that the conditions are the same so as to put Mexico first, but I think they found a number of coincidences. And so I don't think it was a friendship in the sense of a degree of chemistry being present. It was more about a style of politics and a vision of their own countries. And of course, that rubbed right up against a true partnership between Mexico and the United States, because I don't think that we can talk about a true partnership under Trump and López Obrador. It was not that. It was an accommodation. Perhaps López Obrador, as David mentioned, was more pragmatic and had to accommodate certain things, but this was not a partnership, and it certainly was not a friendship. It was simply a common vision that gave them some direction to stay out of each other's way. And in that sense, I think they found the basis for building a relationship. Now, I think Mr. López Obrador has made several mistakes in the beginning of the Biden administration. Well, the transition period, I guess, November, December, and January, by poking his eye, unnecessarily so. I think it may be true that Mr. López Obrador intends to be pragmatic and intends to and will have to establish some kind of relationship with Washington. But as of right now, he has taken several opportunities to elbow Biden and his team, and again, unnecessarily so. He could have issued a tentative, tepid congratulations for Mr. Biden, even if it was conditioned by wording that clearly states that there was a process to be played out. But he refused, and he was told, and he refused. And I think the offering Assange asylum is a gratuitous stand. It serves very little or no purpose whatsoever. And I think pulling out the Ambassador Marta Bárcena from Washington, I think, is a mistake. When she was just starting to know Washington and understand Washington and establish connections and relationships in Washington and know who's who, and could very quickly fall in the shoes of the new, not so new ambassador in relationships in Washington. All of a sudden, he sends a politician. I think that's probably a less than wise mistake that he's making. And I think Mr. López Obrador is clearly toying with fire when it comes to the USMCA. I think that he's got a contradiction in there, and I'll say a few words about that in a minute. But I think he's probably beginning to play with a little fire. So there's a number of issues that I think were unnecessary. Sometimes it is best to keep silence and not provoke. And I think Mr. López Obrador chose to provoke the new administration. I do agree with Maria Cristina. I don't think that Biden is he doesn't have the psychological needs that Trump had for reaffirmation, for praise, for all kinds of things like that. It's not going to go through there. On the contrary, he's a very institutional man. You know, he's gonna choose that route, and I think that will clearly be the tone coming from Washington. What will the tone be coming from Mexico City? That I think is a little bit less discernible at this moment, but if any of these provocations, however minute, are a sign, Mr. López Obrador clearly does not see the incoming administration as an ally or as a friend, certainly less so than the Trump administration. And that is something that we're going to have to be watching, because I think it's going to be an important thing. Having said that, I do agree with the general understanding in our conversation that very likely what happens in the binational relationship will depend more on Mexico than on Washington. In other words, I think Mr. Biden will open his arms to cooperation with Mexico. I think he understands the importance of Mexico in the relationship, and I think it'll be up to López Obrador to accommodate American interests in Mexico as defined by the Biden administration. If he refuses to do it, then the administration will be doubly or triply difficult. So much of the tone of the administration, of the relationship, will depend on the administration of López Obrador. Whether he opens his arms to Biden's agenda and tries to accommodate that agenda, which will be more complicated, more difficult, more multifaceted than Trump's ever was, and it will depend on him. I'm afraid that he doesn't seem to have the chip to fully understand American interests in Mexico in all the complexity, and he's going to try to resume, because once you are used to dealing with a very one-sided perspective, Trump's, you may want to continue with that perspective, and he's going to, Mr. López Obrador is going to have to relearn the complexity of the relationship and accommodate many more different aspects of it, as David mentioned: immigration, the border, trade and economic integration, financial flows, corruption, the place of the United States in international organizations, environmental and natural resource issues, security, drug trafficking, COVID, and on and on. And I think the Biden administration does have that perspective, and I think Mr. López Obrador will find it overwhelming to have to delegate, because he's not a delegator, and that's one of the major problems. He wants to micromanage the administration. In fact, it is a characteristic of authoritarian populists that they think they can govern alone, and instead of availing themselves of a competent team. In fact, authoritarian populists value loyalty over competence. And so far in the López Obrador administration's team, there has been very little competence, a lot of loyalty, and the individuals like Marcelo Ebrard, who might be more sophisticated in handling binational relationships, the binational relationship, and of course, U.S. Mexican foreign policy, will have to also try to figure out how to placate his boss and deal with a very complicated relationship. And I think it's going to be an important figure to be watching if he survives the next 4 years in that position. Now, obviously, a couple of other things that I think are important. There is a two-level game that each of these presidents has, and the domestic level is going to affect the international level and vice versa. So what are the conditions that Mr. López Obrador is facing? He's facing an election in the next 5 months or so, less now. And he's facing a strong division within his own political party. It is not, I guess, a secret that within Morena, President López Obrador's party, there are two wings. There is a communist wing. There is a pro-Cuba, pro-Venezuela, pro-Russia wing. There are radical people within that political party, and the PT, which is one of his major allies. And there are people who are very anti-American. and pull Mexico and want to pull Mexico in that direction to sever its dependence and ties with the United States. And then there's a more moderate wing, and I think Mr. López Obrador will have to figure out how to accommodate this and prevent his political party from splitting. I think that we often forget that Mr. López Obrador got into power partly backed by this very radical, very anti-American, pro-Cuba, pro-Sao Paulo Forum, pro-Venezuela wing, and I think it's within Morena. But there's also a redeemable side of Morena that is more pragmatic, I think represented perhaps by Marcelo Ebrard. I think the mayor of Mexico City is a little bit more on the other side. So there's clearly figures that Mr. López Obrador is going to have to balance within in his dealing with the United States. The question is going to be where Esteban Moctezuma is. Is he on the more moderate wing? Is he on the more diplomatic, complex thinker type of wing, or is he more on the with the more radicals, more anti-Americans? And I think that's going to be key, especially once Marta Bárcena has been removed. In the case of Joe Biden, I think there are some really serious structural issues. And for the Biden administration, it would be better to have Canada and Mexico flanking U.S. efforts on the international level. On November 15th, there was a major commercial alliance in Asia with China as the centerpiece, the huge centerpiece. This market, this new market, emerging market trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia may have, if you exclude India, 35% of the world's population. Or if you include India, it may actually end up being about 3.7, almost 3.7 billion people out of a humanity of 7 billion. So we're talking about over 50%. Clearly, that dwarfs the United States, and that dwarfs Europe. And I think the gravitational pull of the international economy moves towards Asia. The central focus moves toward Asia. And that is where I think the United States will have to depend on its allies and friends. And of course, Europe, Canada are there. Mexico less hesitant. And Mexico is going to have to choose because it's going to be in a situation in which it can add to a potential alignment with the United States, or it can be a very reluctant partner, or it can be an underminer of the American agenda on the international stage. And I think that is when Mr. López Obrador is going to face some serious pressure from Washington, D.C. So I think let's look at the team for a second. Clearly, Biden has already assigned Alejandro Mayorkas to DHS with many international investigations through the Homeland Security Investigations team that has a lot of work to do. He's a Cuban, and we should not forget where Cubans stand. And I don't think that Mr. Alejandro Mayorkas all of a sudden is going to think like an immigrant from Puerto Rico or from Argentina or from Mexico. He is a Cuban. That's the reality of his background, and I think that matters. Juan González, I think, is a Colombian. Is that pointing towards the idea that Colombia is the model? Colombia has been very pliant and very accommodating of the United States, and its efforts have paid relatively handsomely. I don't think Colombia is a perfect place, but it is a model. And Mexico was kind of following that model at some point until López Obrador. So will Biden retake that, pressure Mexico into that? We don't know. That's going to be interesting to watch Juan González. Of course, Roberta Jacobson. Roberta Jacobson is no fool. She knows Mexico. She understands Mexico. She speaks Spanish. She's lived in Mexico. She knows what the issues are. She knows the complexity of the issues. She has a lot of relationships in Mexico. And she knows all the tricks. She's not easily deceived She's a very smart woman, and she will know where to go and where to press. I think it'll be an interesting person, this new border czar, without being named border czar. Is going to be an interesting person to watch. The other person to watch is going to be Catherine Ita in the USTR. I think that although Catherine Ita's expertise is China and the Pacific region, especially the Asian side of the Pacific region, clearly one of her major jobs is to ensure that the USMCA is fully implemented. And I think this is where we're going to see a lot of different fires, not just in energy, but in the Secretary of the Economy of Mexico, Tatiana Cloutier, who probably understands very little about economics, just recently threatened an agricultural war with the United States, which is completely absurd. Again, one of those absurdities when Mexico is an importer of 2/3 of its grains, corn, wheat, rice, beans, and so on. All of a sudden, she says, if you pressure us on energy, we'll pressure you on energy. Does she really believe that she stands to win an agricultural fight with the United States? I think she has to figure out how economics works, how trade works, and what it means. She cannot be issuing idle threats. And this is where I think the López Obrador administration lacks the kind of thing that she needs. So to conclude, I think Mexico should know and understand its place. I think the Canadian model is a very good model. Canada understands, embraces, and takes advantage of its relationship with the United States and even its dependence on the United States. Canada has been very smart in handling its relationship with the United States, even under the Trump administration. It has provoked very little, and it has given in where it needs to give in. And Canada is even more isolated than Mexico. In some ways, Canada has two views, well, three: south to the US, Europe, and Asia. And Canada slowly has been kind of rebalancing its position, its strategic position, to take advantage of its resources and its relationships. I think Mexico has an even more important advantage. Not the team to implement it, but I think an important advantage, and it's a 4-directional advantage: north to Latin America, south to Europe, and to Asia. Mexico is ideally positioned to be one of the stronger partners of the West, North America, and Europe. But the vision is not there, because it is an antiquated vision. It is an obsolete vision that Mr. López Obrador brings to the table. And the team is not there because they don't think in those terms. They think about the trapiche economy. They think about isolationism. They think about little roads in Oaxaca. They think about it's a very small mind for a very large strategic country that ought to be thinking much, much broadly in terms of its relationship with the United States. And it should probably embrace it and collaborate actively with the United States, because I think Canada has been very successful at understanding its position, and I think Mexico has been very unsuccessful, and more so now under López Obrador, in understanding its position. So I think the next 4 years are going to be a very bumpy road, because we're not talking about the many little fires that we're going to face on specific elements of cooperation where there's going to be problems even in understanding each other. But because Mexico, under the López Obrador administration, does not possess that vision. It is not its understanding of where Mexico ought to be and should go, and that is a tectonic plate problem. It's not a matter of a fire here and a fire there. And so I think that at the end of the López Obrador administration, Mexico will need to rethink itself and its position in a new world, a world that is surely more Asian than Western. Thank you.
No, I was just going to say, in the interest of time, we've had a fascinating discussion there for an hour. Thank you, Tony. Rather than look at specific topics like immigration reform and trade, etc., I'd like the four of you, you've all heard each other's remarks, and I'm sure you want to respond in some way, perhaps starting with you, Maria Cristina. I'll give each of you the floor again, just to, what has anything that you've heard today moved you in your position? What were the highlights here that you've all heard? You want to respond to each other. I'll give the floor over to each of you to just give some wrap-up remarks, but also perhaps respond to some of the more interesting remarks you've heard today.
Sure, Steve. Thank you, and thank you all for your presentations that I find fascinating. I would like to clarify something that probably was not properly understood. When I spoke about ideological affinity between López Obrador and Trump, I didn't mean by that friendship. I never used the word friendship. That's impossible for me to imagine. What I believe by that, because we have had in the history of Mexico-US relations, personal relationships, such as the ones we saw between Vicente Fox and George W. Bush. I'm sure you all remember that they got along, that they visited each other's homes, and they had a personal friendship. This is not the case for Trump and López Obrador. By affinity, I mean something that was very well described by Tony, the context. I mean, we are living in a world where institutions are being challenged by political leaders. And I believe that's a context we cannot deny. People don't believe in institutions. Many people tend not to believe in institutions, which is why, for instance, the World Health Organization is having a hard time in dealing with the pandemic, because WHO has said, you should wear masks, you should vaccinate yourself. And people say, no, I'm not following WHO because I don't trust it. So we're living in these times of mistrust when it comes to institutions. But apart from that, yes, I would like to say a few words about the security relationship between Mexico and the US and the decisions that President López Obrador has recently made, and decisions he has made since he came into office. You may remember that López Obrador has talked a lot about dealing with the roots of insecurity in the country. He has put attention in social programs because he believes that if we pay attention to development issues, violence may diminish. Well, the thing is that, for example, when we think about the Mérida Initiative, that happens to be important because, in my view, it's a recognition of the necessity of the two countries to work together in dealing with security and organized crime that comes and goes from Mexico into the US and such. When you think about the Mérida Initiative and the attitude that López Obrador has had with regards to that, he doesn't like it because he says that instead of buying weapons and instead of, putting money into arms, we should be putting money on people and social programs. He has done so during his presidency, but the results are far from good. Violence, even during the pandemic, has been increasing, and organized crime is very well organized, I'm sorry to say, which means that probably the mistake made by López Obrador is to get divorced security from development. I believe the approach, I'm not against the approach of working on development issues. I think it's a very good approach, but you cannot do it without working also on security issues. And I believe this is something that probably may be in the agenda. Probably López Obrador could discuss these issues, the relationship between security and development with Biden, and I expect Biden to be sensitive to this. That said, let me tell you also about the immediate challenges pertaining to the pandemic, because yes, that's a major challenge. And yesterday there was a lot of fuss about a comment made by the head of the World Health Organization on the fact that only 10 countries are getting most of the vaccines. And among those countries, we have the US. Mexico even decided to diminish the acquisition of the Pfizer vaccine so that other countries could get the vaccine. So I mentioned this because Mexico is having a major crisis, epidemiological crisis, and the US is also having a major problem. It's not of the interest of the US that Mexico and the rest of Latin America collapses over the pandemic. So cooperation may need to prevail at some point. And I expect Biden taking the lead in dealing with the pandemic, as I mentioned during my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Kim, take it from there.
Thank you so much. My little comment comes from something that Tony began with, and that is the late Bob Pastor and his ideas about North America. Now, I must admit, I didn't always agree with Bob and on his particular perspective, but there is one thing I think that Tony underlined, and it's reflected in what Maria Cristina and David said, and that is that in the years ahead, I'm really hopeful that the three leaders of these countries will rediscover the importance of the trilateral relationship between the three leaders, rather than the countries themselves. Back in the days of George W. Bush and Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, there was a considerable amount of criticism in Canada of the idea of the so-called Three Amigos. But on the other hand, when I look at the future, in particular, where, as Tony says, Mexico is in a unique strategic situation, so too is Canada in a unique strategic situation at this point, with the deterioration of the transatlantic relationship, the increased conflict across the Pacific between the United States and China. Canada's in a position now where it's very much more all alone than it used to be. And so that it seems to me, a real importance here in having the Canadians, the Mexicans deal with the United States in this new era. And so while I never liked the idea of the Three Amigos, I really like the idea of the three heads of government getting together personally, as they used to do before the arrival of Donald Trump. Thank you very much.
David, any further thoughts from what you've heard today?
Well, I'll first apologize. I certainly didn't mean to imply, Maria Cristina, that you were saying that Trump and Biden, Biden and Trump, or Trump and López Obrador are friends. But I do think that this idea of a friendship between the two presidents has been overblown. I was referring specifically to a New York Times article that came out yesterday with the title, "Once a Trump basher, Mexico's leader misses him already." I think that sentiment is greatly overblown. And I worry that parsing and focusing too much on the minor slights, as Tony described them, distracts us from the fact that Biden is a big boy. He's an adult, unlike our outgoing president. And I don't think he necessarily takes offense at what some might assume to be offensive behavior or presume to be offensive behavior. And I think that very quickly we will see an effort by the Biden administration to develop a strong and positive relationship and affinity with the López Obrador administration. And I think López Obrador will be happy, as I said, to not have to deal with Donald Trump. I think that, again, the reason why he's delayed any overtures towards the Biden administration was because he didn't want a tantrum. He didn't want to deal with a preschool president in the reaction of Donald Trump and what he might do in the last days of his administration to retaliate against Mexico. I do think that one of the key things about the Biden administration that's going to be a game changer is the deliberate intention, as others have mentioned, of putting America back on the map, of making the United States, again, not a leader, but the leader of world politics. And yes, it's true that China has been very aggressive in moving into the space that the Trump administration surrendered in our global leadership role. But I do think that the United States is in a position, if we want to assert that leadership, to do so. And bringing together the three amigos, showing that we are unified with our North American neighbors is a part of that. It's an important part of the strategy. Whether China emerges as a new counterweight to the United States or not, we need Canada and Mexico as economic partners and as security partners and so on. And so it is a very logical step, and I do hope one that we will continue to move forward on. I think many of us forget, or maybe many people are not aware of just how long it took the European Union to consolidate. It took 50, 60 years before there was any real integration of Europe. And I think Bob Pastor really took the long view that this was something that we needed to start working on in the context of NAFTA. And I think the survival of NAFTA in the form of the USMCA just underscores how important our relationships with Canada and Mexico are. So I'm always optimistic about Mexico and about the U.S.-Mexico relationship and our prospects, mainly because I have very low expectations and a long time horizon. I think that you have to recognize that in the day-to-day, there are always going to be setbacks, but the long-term trajectory and the long-term incentives for us to work together are really very strong. And there will be, I'm worried, honestly, about the effects of climate change on our relationship. What we saw this summer with the La Boquilla Dam and other conflicts over water, that's only going to get worse in the near future, right? In the next 5-10 years, we're going to be fighting over water a lot. And that does mean that we might need to we're not going to make progress on climate change quickly enough to get more water into the Colorado or the Rio Grande. So we're really going to have to think about issues of equity and also just the economic structure that surrounds the U.S.-Mexico border. It's built on the idea that that we can divert water to the border region. But when the water dries up, it's going to have very significant consequences for the structure of the border economy, and on both sides of the border. And so we need to be thinking, I think, long-term about what that means, what happens to U.S. and Mexican agriculture on the border. And as Tony rightly points out, we can't think of it as a zero-sum competition. It is, we have a lot to gain by working together to address the problem and to find ways to do so equitably. If that means revisiting the 1944 U.S.-Mexico Water Treaty and trying to find either a way to rework that treaty or ways to build on it, I think we certainly have to do something. And Tony's Center recently put out, I think, a very good piece by Steve Mume on the U.S.-Mexico Water Treaty, and I would definitely recommend it to those that are interested in that.
Thank you very much. Tony, from what you've heard today from your fellow guests here, any other thoughts?
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. But I'll cede my time to entertaining a couple of questions. I think that'll be
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to just run through some of the questions we've received, and any of you can chime in and respond. We have Carla Estefany Alvarado Romero. She's saying, since the USMCA is in force and considering the position Kamala Harris took with trade, migration, the environment, and also paying attention to the historical democratic protectionism, which has been referenced earlier, which would be the probable issues in the next few years between the North American members in the frame of the trade agreement, beyond the similarities or differences between the heads of the three states of the region. So a question about USMCA and whether the Democrats might have a different position given, Harris's position and their general being more preferring of protectionism in the past. So any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'll start with that because I think it's an important question, and indeed, this is where I think there's several levels of analysis playing in at the same time, and we have to think about the vertical relationships among them. I think there is a fundamental problem with the way certainly Mexico and the U.S. are thinking about the agricultural sector today, and they're thinking about it as a zero-sum game. I think it was the case with milk and wood with Canada, and I think it was the case with energy in Mexico, and so on. I think in the spirit of a regional integration, economic integration, and the benefits of trade, I think we ought to think about North America as a regional market and the complementarity, and apply those kind of concepts to try to figure that out. However, there is a limit. Obviously, Biden has two tasks that I think are going to be important here. One is going to be to figure out why the rural-urban divide in the United States. Clearly, rural inhabitants of rural areas in the United States are very conservative, and they're afraid of globalization in some ways. Not all of them, obviously. They also see the value in exporting potatoes and wheat and kinds of things like that, having access to China and other markets. But at the same time, the Biden administration is going to have to find a way to assuage their fears of globalization and yet give them access at the same time. Try to moderate their position and listen to them very carefully to try to heal some of these divides in the United States. The urban-rural divide is a very important political divide in the United States. And at the same time say, look, it is in your benefit to have access to these markets. And that is not going to be an easy balancing act. And for Mexico, on energy, it's not going to be a balancing act. Let me say something about energy, about agriculture in Mexico. Mexico has 10-12% arable land. Mexico, it cannot be agriculturally self-sufficient. It's almost impossible. Canada is a powerhouse in that sense, and I think the trilateral relationship can help there. I think the U.S. is a powerhouse. Mexico can benefit from it. Mexico's energy direction today is wrong-headed. It is a wrong strategy for Mexico, and it is a wrong strategy for North America. That's not going to work. Mexico will have to recalibrate its position in the future. So the sooner these countries begin to say, how can we play access to the region and North American markets in the implementation of the USMCA, and at the same time compensate and assuage the losers of trade and economic integration. I think the doubts that brought Donald Trump to power were because we forgot about the losers of trade, and that's a debate that's already there, and it's been well explored. So I think all countries have to figure out how can we slowly open the markets, integrate the markets, create efficiencies, create dependencies that everybody feels comfortable with, and at the same time compensate the losers. And that's where I think you need effective leaders that can play both levels at the same time, and effective teams that can work at the international level, come home, work at the domestic level, and go at the international level. And I think this is where the visions and I insist the vision that López Obrador has for Mexico is paradoxical, it's contradictory, structurally unachievable. The man wants to have a USMCA and violate it. The man wants to have access to US markets and treat certain economic sectors in Mexico with the nationalism of the PRI in the mid-20th century. Those things don't go together. He is going to have to figure out how he's going to reconcile these structural problems in his vision of the country and in his government program and things like that. So this is not an easy question, but I think there are many, many layers to it, but I think we're going to have to think about that more seriously.
Thank you. The next question comes via Facebook. Carol Derwich is from the Jagiellonian University. I probably mispronounced that one as well. I do apologize, but she's all the way from Poland. So that's, thank you, Carol, for writing in. She has two questions. How the last decision on General Cienfuegos in Mexico can influence the future US-Mexico cooperation in the area of combating organized crime, and what are the Biden administration's plans to prevent a humanitarian crisis? How can that be put into effect? And she mentions the Honduran migrant caravan. Any of the four of you want to take a stab at those questions? David?
Yeah, I'm happy. I know Carol. Carol came to University of San Diego a few years ago to spend some time with us. And so, hi, Carol. I thought it was later, but it's only like 7 p.m. in Poland. So I was going to tell him to go to sleep. But on the first question, I do think, we referred to this earlier. I think that, again, the arrest of General Cienfuegos was a unilateral action by the Trump administration. And strategically, that might have been smart in the short term because it made it possible to make the arrest. But the longer term and larger implications of arresting a high-level Mexican official and a military official without consulting the Mexican government was really, I think, a big mistake. And I think that the Biden administration will need to recognize that there are enormous sensitivities on the Mexican side about that kind of unilateral action. It's certainly not been characteristic of the Merida Initiative and cooperation under the Merida Initiative, which has been unprecedentedly bilateral. And I think the reason the Merida Initiative has had such staying power, U.S.-Mexico security cooperation has been so strong, is precisely because we haven't engaged in this kind of unilateral action in the past. It's notable that we didn't see a similar reaction after the arrest of Garcia Luna. And I believe that's because there was an effort by the Trump administration and by Bill Barr when he went to Mexico to sit down and talk with López Obrador to keep the Mexican government informed about precisely what they were going to do. And so I think and hope that it was an aberration that we acted in that unilateral fashion. We certainly are going to pay a price for it. I think lots of people put their lives on the line to get the intelligence that was used in the Cienfuegos case. And I think that unfortunately all that effort was wasted because it was not done in a way that was unilateral. On the question of Biden's plans to prevent humanitarian crisis, I think one thing we're going to see from the Biden administration that is a little different than what we saw in the Trump administration. The Trump administration worked multilaterally in Central America and with Mexico as well to try to basically extend the wall, extend the U.S. security perimeter by getting the Mexican government and Central American governments to try to restrict flows of migrants. And I think the The Biden administration will almost surely take a different approach, a more, as Maria Cristina mentioned, a more development-focused approach that will try to help Central American governments better address the economic needs and also the security conditions that are contributing to the mass exodus of people from Central America through Mexico. There needs to be we've tried in the past to think about ways of developing economic cooperation with Central America. The Central American Free Trade Agreement was all about giving U.S. businesses access to Central America and not really as focused on developmental problems in Central America. And so we need to see a shift towards really addressing those problems, because it is, unless we do, we will continue to see people fleeing both for economic and security reasons. The two, economics and security, are clearly tied in that relationship. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I want to add something to that, Steve, if I may. I think the problem, this is where I think the issues become kind of intermestic, right? I mean, the problem with I think Cienfuegos is the fact that it is one more item, in this particular case, an international issue, but it's been there before in the 2 years and months of the almost 2 years and a half of the López Obrador administration, in which I think by exonerating Mr. Cienfuegos, regardless of the I guess the way the U.S. acted unilaterally, I agree with that, is that all of a sudden the López Obrador administration is finding itself cuddling individuals like Lozoya, like Cienfuegos, his own brother Pio. And so all of a sudden his flag of anti-corruption, anti-impunity is looking quite tattered. And so I think he is undermining his own political message by doing that. So in some sense, I think the United States managed to expose the inconsistencies within the López Obrador administration. This is a very serious issue, and I think it's going to undermine his political stance, and it's going to undermine the political campaign of his own political party between now and June, because the other parties are going to simply be able to point to Pio and Lozoya and Cienfuegos and everybody else. And I think the consequences, domestic consequences, will be serious. That will, of course, complicate the issue of collaborating on security with the United States, because I think Mr. López Obrador has relied on the military because he has so undermined public administration, the state apparatus, administrative apparatus. He starved it. And there has been an exodus of talent and so on, that he finds himself practically without a team, even to manage the bilateral relationship, to manage trade, to manage the implementation of American agreements. And then they make mistakes like not taking seriously the apprehension of Mr. Cienfuegos. That is going to complicate the leverage that Mr. López Obrador is going to have at home and also internationally.
Thank you.
One quick thing about the caravans. I agree with David wholeheartedly. This is an international issue, and Mexico and the United States have to have a plan, a joint plan for Central America.
Thank you, Tony. I'm being told we haven't got too much time now. We've got to wrap it up soon. So I just want to get very quickly one more question in. Alex Muller asks whether Trumpism has had an impact on societies, and perhaps to some degree even the political culture in Mexico and Canada, and if that's the case, what role is this ultra-nationalistic, mercantilist mindset? Can you predict for the upcoming 4 years of the Biden administration, Mexico, Canada, domestic matters and their relationship with the US? Does Trumpism have any impact, as it had perhaps gained sway in either of those two countries? Very quickly.
I think it's a very very intelligent question. I mean, it's not just about whether Trumpism has had an effect on the political culture of Mexico and Canada, but frankly, all around the world, we've seen the rise of ultra-nationalist populism and mercantilism at a level we have not seen in decades.
I'd like to also thank Mary Cruz Amador for asking a question. We haven't had time to get to that one. And Carla Estefany Alvarado Romero had a second question. Unfortunately, there's not time for that. We do have to wrap it up now. So I want to thank our very special guests today, Kim Nossel, David Shirk, and Tony Payan. Thank you. And of course, Maria Cristina, none of this is possible without her fantastic leadership. Thank you for everyone at the Centro Olaf Palm Center in Mexico City. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Been fascinating, very absorbing, very detailed conversation about what we can expect from Biden with regard to North American relations. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Good to meet
you.
you, David. Thank you, Maria Cristina.
Thank you.
Good to
I
meet
just
you.
want to say that let's hope for the best tomorrow.
Very
Yes.
important.
Thanks for
Never know.
Thanks, everyone.